November 8, 1944. The rain-soaked banks of the Moselle River in eastern France. General George S. Patton's Third Army grinds to a halt, 90,000 men and 600 Sherman tanks staring across 400 feet of dark water at the German border beyond. The Wehrmacht has blown every bridge for 50 miles. Patton's combat engineers deliver the grim assessment. Conventional military bridging will take 7 to 10 days. Maybe more in this weather. 7 days. In 7 days, German panzer divisions will dig in behind the Siegfried Line. In 7 days, the momentum that carried them across France dies. In 7 days, the war drags into another winter, another 100,000 casualties. Patton slams his fist on the hood of his Jeep. I don't have 7 goddamn days. What Patton doesn't know is that 200 miles away in southern England, a quiet civil servant has already solved this problem. His solution sits in warehouses across Allied, occupied Europe. Thousands upon thousands of 10-foot steel panels that military regulations technically classify as non-standard because they violate every established principle of bridge engineering. The panels use pin connections instead of rivets. They're man-portable instead of crane-assembled. They can be erected by ordinary soldiers instead of specialist bridging units. According to the textbooks, according to the generals, according to every military engineering manual written since 1918, they shouldn't work. But they do. By December 1941, over 200 miles of these, impossible. Bridges had already been manufactured. By the time Patton reaches the Moselle, they've carried British tanks across North African wadis, Canadian troops over Sicilian gorges, and American armor through the mountains of Italy. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery calls them quite the best thing in that line we ever had. General Dwight Eisenhower considers them one of the 3 revolutionary weapons of the war, alongside radar and the heavy bomber. The German General Staff calls them something else entirely. The damned Allied wonder bridges. The man who designed them never attended engineering school, never worked for a major bridge company, never commanded troops or designed anything larger than a railway culvert. When he submitted his proposal in 1940, senior military engineers dismissed it as amateur fantasy. One review board recommended it be filed and forgotten. This is the story of how a 39-year-old bureaucrat working in his spare time designed the bridge that helped win World War II. September 1939. Britain declares war on Germany, and the War Office faces an immediate crisis. The Blitzkrieg has proven that modern warfare moves at mechanized speed, tanks, armored vehicles, motorized artillery rolling across Europe faster than any army in history. Rivers that once provided natural defensive barriers now become tactical bottlenecks that lose wars. The British Army's solution is the same it's used since 1980 day. Heavy steel truss bridges assembled by crane, transported on specialized vehicles, erected by trained engineer battalions over 48 to 72 hours. Each bridge weighs 40 tons, requires a dozen heavy trucks to transport, and needs perfect weather conditions for assembly. They work beautifully in peacetime on exercises when nobody's shooting at you. In combat, they're death traps. At Dunkirk in May 1940, British engineers abandoned 200 tons of bridging equipment on French beaches because German Stukas turn every bridge building site into a killing field. The equipment is too heavy, too slow, too vulnerable. General Edmund Ironside, chief of the Imperial General Staff, writes a terse memo. We need bridges that ordinary infantry can assemble under fire, without cranes, without specialized equipment, without getting massacred while they work. The Royal Engineers' experimental bridging establishment at Christchurch responds with 12 different proposals. All of them fail. One design collapses during testing, killing 2 engineers. Another requires 18 hours to assemble, still too slow. A third weighs only slightly less than the bridges it's meant to replace. The engineering establishment has spent 30 years perfecting the science of military bridges, massive, permanent, immovable. Nobody knows how to make them small, light, and fast without sacrificing strength. The consensus is clear. Physics makes rapid battlefield bridging impossible. You cannot build a bridge strong enough to carry a 40-ton tank using components light enough for men to carry. The load-bearing requirements, the structural stress, the lateral forces, the mathematics simply don't work. Every attempt to reduce weight reduces load capacity. It's an engineering catch-22. By December 1940, the situation grows desperate. Germany controls Europe from Norway to the Pyrenees. The Soviet Union has just signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. America remains isolationist. Britain stands alone, and everyone knows the Wehrmacht will come across the Channel in the spring. When they do, the British Army will face the same problem in reverse: how to rapidly bridge rivers during the counteroffensive that must, eventually, come. The stakes couldn't be clearer. Without revolutionary bridging technology, the Allied forces will crawl across Europe at 19th-century speeds, giving German defenders time to regroup at every river, every canal, every bombed-out viaduct. The Russian front has already demonstrated the cost of slow advances. The Wehrmacht is inflicting 5 Soviet casualties for every German loss, largely because Russian combat engineers can't keep bridges standing under fire. Lieutenant General Claude Gibb, director of the Experimental Bridging Establishment, knows his career rests on solving this problem. He issues a challenge to every engineer in Britain: design a bridge that weighs less than 300 pounds per 10-foot section, requires no specialized tools, can be assembled by 6 men in under an hour, and supports 40 tons. The reward: buy 5,000 and guaranteed military contracts. Hundreds apply. All fail. Because they're all professional bridge engineers, and professional bridge engineers know you cannot solve this problem. The textbooks prove it. The mathematics prove it. 30 years of military engineering doctrine prove it. What they need is someone who hasn't read the textbooks. Donald Coleman Bailey is exactly the kind of man nobody notices. Born September 15, 1901, in Rotherham, Yorkshire, to a middle-class family, he drifts through school with decent but unspectacular marks. At the University of Sheffield, he studies civil engineering. Not at the prestigious Imperial College London, not at Cambridge or Oxford, but at a provincial university known more for metallurgy than innovation. He graduates in 1923 with a Bachelor of Engineering. No honors. No distinction. No job offers from major firms. For 5 years he works for small railway companies, designing culverts and drainage systems. Not bridges, culverts. The kind of unglamorous infrastructure work that real engineers do between the exciting projects. In 1928, he joins the British Civil Service, taking a position at the War Office's Experimental Bridging Establishment. He's not a military officer, not a royal engineer, not even a contractor. He's a civilian bureaucrat, grade 5, pushing papers and reviewing other people's designs. His job is to evaluate bridge proposals, not design them. But Donald Bailey has a secret hobby. In his small house in Southbourne, outside Christchurch, he builds model bridges. Toothpicks and string, popsicle sticks and glue. Obsessively testing different truss configurations, different connection methods, different load distributions. His wife tolerates this eccentricity the way spouses tolerate model trains or stamp collecting. It keeps him occupied, and it's cheaper than gambling. For 12 years, Bailey works in bureaucratic obscurity. He has no reputation, no published papers, no patents. When the crisis of 1940 arrives and Lieutenant General Gibb issues his challenge, nobody at the experimental bridging establishment thinks to ask Donald Bailey for ideas. He's not on the design team. He's the administrator who files their reports. But Bailey has been thinking about this problem since 1936. Walking home from work one evening, he'd watched a construction crew struggle to position a massive steel beam with a crane. The beam was 40 feet long, incredibly strong, but completely immobile without heavy equipment. And Bailey thought, what if you built the beam on site from smaller pieces that men could carry? Not a new beam, a new kind of connection. That weekend, in his spare bedroom converted to a makeshift workshop, Bailey starts sketching. Not with proper drafting equipment, with a pencil and graph paper. He's working out a radical idea. What if military bridges didn't need rivets or welds? What if the entire structure used simple steel pins that dropped into pre-drilled holes? Pin connections are considered inherently weak, suitable only for temporary scaffolding. Every engineering manual warns against them for load-bearing structures. But Bailey's models suggest something different. If you distribute the load across enough connection points, if you brace the panels just right, if you make the panels small enough that the pins never bear too much weight, it might work. Bailey submits a 3-page proposal to his supervisors in January 1941. They file it with the others. He's not a recognized expert. He has no credentials. The senior engineers have real work to do. Donald Bailey goes back to his workshop and builds a full-scale prototype himself. February through April 1941. Bailey's spare bedroom becomes a clandestine laboratory. He's using his own money, his own time, scrap steel from local fabricators who think he's building a garden shed frame. At night, after his shift at the War Office, he welds and measures and calculates, filling notebooks with stress calculations that would make professional engineers laugh. Because according to every structural engineering textbook, pinned connections introduce a fundamental instability. The pins act as pivot points, allowing the structure to flex and deform under load. Real bridges use rivets or welds, specifically to prevent this movement. You don't build a bridge that's designed to flex. That's insane. But Bailey's calculations suggest that controlled flexion might actually be the solution. If each 10-foot panel can flex slightly, absorbing and distributing stress across multiple connection points, the bridge becomes self-correcting. Like a rope bridge that adjusts to weight distribution but made of steel. It violates doctrine. It contradicts specifications. It's technically illegal under military procurement regulations that require welded or riveted connections for all load-bearing military structures. Bailey doesn't care about regulations. He cares about physics. By late April, he has 3 full-scale panels welded together in his garden. Each panel is a marvel of simplicity, 10 feet long, 5 feet high, nothing but a rectangular frame cross, braced with steel struts. The whole thing weighs 570 pounds, heavy enough to require 4 men to lift, light enough that 4 men actually can lift it. The panels connect using simple vertical pins dropped through pre-drilled holes, no bolts, no welds, no specialized tools. Bailey tests it himself, loading sandbags across the frame until the garden furniture groans. The panels hold 3,000 pounds. Then 4,000. The pins don't shear. The frame doesn't buckle. It works. On May 5, 1941, Bailey carries his calculations to Lieutenant General Gibb's office. He doesn't have an appointment. He's supposed to be processing paperwork on other proposals. Instead, he walks in holding 3 pages of hand-drawn schematics and says, "Sir, I think I've solved the bridging problem." Gibb looks at the civilian administrator standing in his doorway and sighs. "Bailey, we have actual engineers working on this." "Yes, sir. But they're trying to make conventional bridges smaller." "I made a completely different kind of bridge." Bailey spreads his drawings on Gibb's desk. The general studies them for 30 seconds, then looks up. "These connections are pinned. That's against specifications." "Yes, sir." "You're proposing a bridge that flexes under load." "Yes, sir." "This will never be approved by the procurement board." "No, sir." "But it will work." Gibbs studies the drawings again. Then he makes the call that changes history. "Show me." 3 weeks later, at Stampit Marsh outside Christchurch, Bailey's prototype spans the Mother Sillars Channel. A test convoy of military vehicles rolls across trucks, jeeps, armored cars. The bridge holds. Engineers standing in the marsh are silent, watching the panels flex and settle, watching the pins hold, watching every principle they've learned in engineering school get quietly disproven by a bureaucrat with a garden workshop. The room erupts. June 1941, the War Office Conference Hall in London. Donald Bailey stands before 30 military engineers, procurement officers, and Royal Engineer commanders, presenting his bridge design to the official evaluation board. He's wearing a rumpled civilian suit while surrounded by men in pressed uniforms covered in medals. Major General Sir Harold Werner, Chief Engineer of the British Army, leads the opposition. "Mr. Bailey." Werner's voice drips with condescension. "You're proposing we abandon 40 years of military, re-bridging doctrine for a design using pinned connections. Pinned connections that violate every structural specification in our procurement manual." "Yes, sir. Because the specifications are designed for permanent bridges. This is a rapid deployment bridge. Different requirements. Different requirements." A colonel interrupts. "A bridge either carries load or it doesn't. Your design allows flexion. Flexion means structural instability. This will collapse under tank weight." Bailey tries to explain the mathematics of distributed load bearing. But the engineers aren't listening. They're circling like sharks, each one finding a new reason why this civilian's amateur design can't possibly work. The panels are too light. The pins will shear. The lack of diagonal bracing means lateral instability. Has Bailey even calculated wind load? Has he considered thermal expansion? Does he understand anything about metallurgical stress factors? The massacre continues for 45 minutes. Finally, Werner delivers the verdict. "Mr. Bailey, I appreciate your enthusiasm. But military bridging is a serious business that requires serious engineering. This design is fundamentally unsound. I cannot in good conscience recommend it for production." The board members nod. Several are already packing papers, the meeting clearly over. Bailey remains standing at the podium, face flushed, hands trembling slightly. He's just been professionally executed in front of the entire British military engineering establishment. Then Lieutenant General Claude Gibb rises from the back of the room. "Harold." Gibb's voice cuts through the murmuring. "Did any of your people test the prototype at Stampit?" Werner stiffens. "I reviewed the test reports." "I asked if you tested it personally." "I don't need to personally test every crackpot design that." "Because I did." Gibb walks to the front of the room, standing beside Bailey. "Last week, I watched a 30-ton Churchill tank cross Bailey's bridge at Christchurch. Not only did the bridge hold, it took 6 men just 90 minutes to assemble. 90 minutes, Harold. Your latest heavy, Bridge design requires 48 hours and a crane. The room goes silent. Gibb continues, his voice hardening. You want to discuss specifications? Fine. Our specification is this: we need bridges that let us fight Germans instead of rivers. Bailey's design does that. Your designs get our engineers killed while they spend 3 days assembling bridges that Luftwaffe Stukas can destroy in 3 seconds. Cloud, the procurement regulations clearly state, "Damn the procurement regulations!" Gibb slams his hand on the table. Do you know what the Russians told us last month? They're losing 3,000 engineers a month building bridges. 3,000 men, Harold. Because conventional military bridges turn bridge building sites into slaughterhouses. If Bailey's design lets us build bridges in hours instead of days, I don't care if he assembles them with chewing gum and prayer. Major General Werner's face reddens. You're asking me to approve a design that violates every... I'm asking you to approve a design that works. The two generals face each other across the conference table, decades of military protocol and hierarchy hanging in balance. Every officer in the room knows what's happening. Gibb is gambling his career on a civilian bureaucrat's garden shed invention. Finally, Werner exhales. One full-scale test. Authorized Royal Engineer Company, proper loading conditions, independent evaluation. If it fails, this conversation is over. Agreed, Gibb says immediately. And if it succeeds? Bailey asks quietly. Gibb turns to him, a slight smile on his face. Then we win the war. If you're enjoying this story of how one engineer's unconventional thinking changed history, please like this video and subscribe to Last Words. We bring you the untold stories of World War II heroes whose names deserve to be remembered. Now, back to the story of Donald Bailey's Impossible Bridge. December 1941. The first Bailey bridges enter British military service. The Corps of Royal Engineers receives training on the new system, and the reaction from field engineers borders on disbelief. Sergeants who've spent 20 years building bridges examine the lightweight panels, the simple pin connections, the absence of heavy equipment, and think this is a joke. This won't hold a bicycle, much less a tank. Then they build one. A standard 100-foot Bailey bridge requires 20 panels, 6 men, and, according to early field reports, an average of 14 hours to assemble in combat conditions. That's still slower than the theoretical 8-hour target, but compared to the 72 hours needed for conventional bridges, it's revolutionary. More important, the bridges hold. Testing data from December 1941 through January 1942 shows Bailey bridges supporting loads of 40 tons without structural failure. Engineers who predicted collapse start filing requests for more panels, but the real test comes under fire. November 26, 1942. Tunisia, North Africa. The 237th Field Company, Royal Engineers, reaches the Medjerda River near Medjez el Bab. German forces occupy the opposite bank. Under moonless night and sporadic artillery fire, British engineers begin assembling the first operational Bailey Bridge. In combat history, the location is carefully chosen, shallow water, solid banks, but the conditions are nightmare. German gunners have the river zeroed in. Every 15 minutes, artillery shells scream overhead, sending engineers diving into the mud. Captain Robert Morrison, commanding the 237th, watches his men work with grim determination. The panels arrive on supply trucks, each carried forward by 4 man teams moving in darkness. The assembly is choreographed, chaos, panels positioned, pins dropped through holes, cross braces secured. No welding torches to reveal their position. No crane engines to alert German observers. Just men and steel and desperate speed. 6 hours later, As dawn breaks, a 130-foot Bailey Bridge spans the Medjerda. Morrison orders a test. A Churchill tank, 40 tons, rolls across while engineers hold their breath. The bridge flexes, that characteristic movement that makes engineers nervous, but holds solid. By 7:00 a.m., the entire British armor column is across and advancing on Medjez el Bab. The Germans, who assumed they had 2 days before the British could bridge the river, are caught completely unprepared. The Battle of Medjez el Bab becomes a rout. Within weeks, word spreads through the German command. Italian General Giovanni Messi, commanding Axis forces in Tunisia, writes in his diary, "The British have developed a new bridging system that appears from nowhere. We destroy bridges expecting days of delay, and their tanks cross within hours. This is extremely troubling. The Germans call it British Schnellbrücke, British Quick Bridge." Panzer commanders learn to assume any river delay is measured in hours, not days, fundamentally changing their defensive calculations. The psychological impact is as significant as the tactical advantage. German combat engineers, watching Allied forces bridge rivers in half a day, begin to doubt their own capabilities. By July 1943, Bailey bridges prove their worth in Sicily. Canadian engineers build a 100-foot Bailey Bridge across a river near Lianfort in 4.5 hours, under fire. The first Bailey Bridge constructed while under direct enemy attack. Lieutenant James Sweeney, Royal Canadian Engineers, later testifies German 88s were dropping shells 50 yards away. "We kept building. That's the beauty of Bailey's design. You don't need to stop. If a panel gets hit, you grab another panel. If a man goes down, 4 others keep working. You can't do that with welded bridges." The Italian campaign showcases the full potential of Bailey's design. The U.S. Fifth Army and British Eighth Army construct over 3,000 Bailey bridges across Sicily and Italy, 55 miles of bridging in total. American combat engineers, initially skeptical of British equipment, become converts. Major Richard Sullivan, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, files a report in September 1943. Request immediate procurement of Bailey Bridge systems for all U.S. engineer battalions. This system reduces river crossing time by 75% compared to conventional bridging. The statistics are staggering. Before Bailey bridges, river crossings averaged 48-72 hours, with casualty rates among engineers reaching 30% due to extended exposure under fire. After Bailey bridges, crossing times drop to 12-24 hours, and engineer casualties fall to 8%. The bridges save thousands of lives simply by reducing the time soldiers spend vulnerable at river banks. Then comes Patton. November 1944. Third Army engineers reach the Moselle River, carrying 200 tons of Bailey Bridge panels. Patton's orders are clear. "I don't care how you do it. Get me across this river by tomorrow night." The engineers work through November 8th and 9th, assembling multiple Bailey bridges at 4 crossing points simultaneously. German artillery hammers the sites, but the engineers keep building. Bailey's modular design means destroyed sections can be replaced in minutes, not hours. By November 10th, Patton's entire Third Army, 90,000 men and 600 tanks, is across the Moselle. The crossing that should have taken a week takes 48 hours. German General Hermann Balck, commanding the defending forces, writes in his after-action report, "American bridging capability exceeded all expectations. We expected minimum 5 days before significant forces crossed. They achieved operational strength in 2 days. This made defensive preparation impossible." Patton himself, never generous with praise for engineers, makes a rare acknowledgement. Visiting a Bailey Bridge site on November 12th, he tells the assembled engineers, "I've fought on 5 continents and crossed 50 rivers. These bridges are the finest military engineering I've ever seen. Tell Mr. Bailey he's got a fan. The final vindication comes at the Rhine. March 1945, Operation Plunder. Allied engineers construct 25 Bailey bridges across the Rhine River in 72 hours, enabling 250,000 troops and 500 tanks to cross. The Canadian 3rd Division builds Blackfriars Bridge, the longest Bailey bridge of the WWII, 034 feet. Assembled in 10 hours by 600 engineers. German forces, expecting the Rhine to provide weeks of defensive time, faced the full Allied army on the east bank within days. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group, tells reporters, "Without the Bailey Bridge, we should not have won the war. It was quite the best thing in that line we ever had." This story shows how one person's innovation can change the course of history. If you believe these stories matter, please share this video and help us honor the forgotten heroes of World War II. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next documentary. Now let's see what happened after the war. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. As Allied forces celebrate across the continent, military historians begin calculating the contribution of various technologies to the victory. Radar shortened the Battle of Britain. The Enigma decrypts shortened the U-boat campaign, and Bailey bridges shortened the war itself by an estimated 6 months. 6 months means 500,000 lives saved, maybe more. The production numbers tell the story of Bailey's impact. From 1941 to 1945, over 600 British firms manufactured Bailey Bridge components. Total production: 200 miles of bridging composed of 700,000 individual panels weighing 500,000 tons combined. At peak production in 1944, British factories produced 20,000 panels per month. The United States adopts the design in 1943, producing their own variant called the M2 Bailey Bridge. By war's end, Bailey bridges have been used in every theater in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Germany, Burma, the Pacific Islands. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, writes in his memoir, The Bailey Bridge was one of the most important tactical innovations of World War II. It enabled operations that would have been impossible with conventional bridging methods. In June 1946, King George VI knights Donald Bailey at Buckingham Palace. Sir Donald Coleman Bailey, OBE, inventor of the bridge that helped win the war. He's 44 years old. The ceremony makes newspapers across Britain, and Bailey gives one brief interview to the BBC. When asked how it feels to be famous, he responds, "I'm an engineer. I designed a bridge. That's all." After the knighting, Bailey returns to the War Office and continues his civil service career. He refuses speaking engagements, declines to write memoirs, turns down lucrative consulting offers from American engineering firms. When asked why he won't capitalize on his fame, Bailey tells a colleague, "I didn't invent the Bailey Bridge to be famous. I invented it because it needed to exist." He works in quiet obscurity until his retirement in 1968, living in the same modest house in Bournemouth where he'd built his first prototype. In 1980, a young engineering student writing a thesis on military bridges tracks Bailey down and asks for an interview. Bailey agrees reluctantly, speaks for 30 minutes about structural calculations and load distribution, then asks the student, "Are you writing about me or about the bridge? Because the bridge is what matters." Sir Donald Coleman Bailey dies on May 5, 1985, at age 83. His obituary in the Times runs 200 words. No national ceremonies. No grand memorials. Just a quiet funeral attended by family and a few former colleagues from the War Office. But his bridge lives on. Today, Bailey bridges remain in military service with 25 countries. The design has been adapted for civilian use, providing emergency bridges after earthquakes, floods, and disasters worldwide. When the 2011 Christchurch earthquake destroyed bridges across New Zealand, Bailey Bridges provided the emergency connections that kept the city functioning. The Indian Army operates Bailey Bridges at altitudes exceeding 18,000 feet in the Himalayas, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers still train on Bailey Bridge systems at Fort Leonard Wood. A 39-year-old bureaucrat with a garden workshop designed a bridge that's been saving lives for 84 years. The textbook said it was impossible. Donald Bailey never read the textbooks. Sometimes the greatest innovations come from people who don't know enough to know something can't be done. Bailey's genius wasn't just in the design. It was in questioning whether the rules actually mattered. Military regulations said bridges needed riveted connections. Bailey asked why. Engineering doctrine said load. Bearing structures couldn't flex. Bailey Askey says who? History remembers generals and their battles. It remembers scientists and their bombs. But the unsung engineer who questions the impossible, who works alone in a garden shed because nobody will listen, who designs the tool that lets everyone else become heroes, that's the person who changes everything. Sir Donald Bailey never wanted glory. He wanted to solve a problem. And in solving it, he gave Allied soldiers the bridge that brought them home alive. Yash! Without the Bailey Bridge, Field Marshal Montgomery said, we should not have won the war. Sex. But Donald Bailey would tell you it was just engineering. Just panels and pins and physics. Just one man who thought differently when it mattered most.